Just starting with some housekeeping. This webinar is going to be recorded. If you don't want to be seen, then you might want to come off video, but it is actually quite valuable because those of you who have registered will receive a link to a YouTube recording of this video. So if you do miss anything, you can go back and review it with the recording. We'll have the presentation shortly, and then there'll be plenty of opportunity for comments and questions. So I ask you please to use the chat function rather than raising your hand. You'll see a little bubble at the top, more or less middle of your screen that says chat. So use that to put your comments and questions in, and then I will monitor that and we'll have time for those after the presentation. So if you could do that, and just keep on mute unless you're actually talking as part of the comment or question, if you could, throughout the webinar. So this webinar is actually part of a project that AgriFutures contracted through the Emerging Industries program under their targeted industries component of the program, which focuses on issues of relevance and benefit across multiple emerging industries. The project's called Horizon Scan for New Market Opportunities in Emerging Industries. It's been undertaken by David Pearce and Yu-Yang He from the Centre for International Economics. David Pearce is a principal and executive director at the Centre for International Economics. He's around 35 years of experience as an applied economist, having worked in a variety of industries, including agriculture, mining, natural resources, climate and the environment, education, finance, as well as international trade and development. David's experience extends beyond Australia to include projects throughout Asia and in Europe. Yu-Yang He is a research economist since completing her postgraduate study at ANU in 2018. Yang has been using a variety of statistical and other tools to undertake economic analyses in transport, energy and environment, economics and agriculture. So I'll hand over now to David and Yang, who'll take you through the project. I just do remind you again to use the chat function and keep on mute. So thanks very much again for being here, and I'll hand over to you, David and Yang.
Thanks, Brenda, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. What is a chilly autumn's morning in Canberra. I don't know what it's like wherever you are, but certainly we've had winter hit us pretty hard this weekend. So what I wanted to do is we'll just go through some of the key findings, I guess, from our project. It's an hour and a half is even too short to go through everything in detail, so we want to give you a bit of an overview and hopefully leave lots of scope for discussion afterwards. Let me just do the normal trick of bringing up my, sharing my screen, and then do the trick of not losing everybody. Is that screen up?
It's up, David, but if you press the, yeah, thank you.
Okay, so, and then just let me. All right, so what I want to do is we'll just take you through some of the key findings, as I said. Now, one of the disadvantages of going into this presentation mode and presenting online is that I can't eyeball anybody and tell whether this is making any sense to any of you or not, so you just have to bear with us. What we want to do is, as Brenda said, go through this project where we've been doing a fairly broad scan of so-called emerging industries and trying to understand what are the key drivers, the key opportunities and the key threats for those industries. And a little bit of what we wanted to do is really draw on two streams of literature, I guess, or two streams of commentary that are out there in the world. One is the sort of the theoretical or business analysis of new products and what it takes for new products to succeed in the world. A second trend, a second branch of literature, I guess, is a lot of discussion around megatrends, which is an approach that a number of organisations take to try to organise information about what's happening in the world. and if any of you involved in agriculture will be aware that there's a huge amount of different trends taking place within agriculture, often pointing in different directions. The sort of the mindset that we've been using to think about these emerging industries and trends is from the point of view of someone who might be an investor or a venture capitalist who's having a look at all the different things going on and wants to try and understand, okay, where should I put my money? And I think an investment perspective is appropriate at this stage because, as you all would have noticed, there's been quite a dramatic macroeconomic change in Australia and around the world, in fact, where an era of relatively easy money, so low interest rates, has changed very quickly into an era where interest rates are rising and capital is becoming a bit of a constraint. But we know that if you want to have a new industry and you want to expand, you have to be funded from somewhere. So that's why we're sort of taking this overview perspective. What do we mean by emerging industries? There's a couple of different ways of looking at emerging industries. From AgriFuture's point of view, an administrative point of view, in a sense, an emerging industry is one of those industries that isn't currently levied in the rural industry around Australia, including both plant and animal-based industries. So these are relatively small industries. They generally have gross value of production less than 5 million, sometimes less than 2 million. I'll just give you this list here. These are some of the examples of emerging industries that Australia's emerging industries that AgriFutures has supported recently. And the ones listed here in light blue are ones that we've also used as case studies for this particular project. Interesting thing about this list of industries, as you go through it, it's got some characteristics. First of all, many of these same industries are recognised as emerging industries around the world in other countries, along with literally hundreds of other emerging industries. Sometimes an emerging industry in one market is a very old and well-established industry in another market. It's just simply being transplanted or being taken up in a new market. And as I already said, there's a lot of overlap between emerging industries as they're supported by AgriFutures and various emerging industries that are in play or being supported elsewhere in the world. So let me just give a couple of theoretical perspectives, I guess, from the point of view of generally thinking about emerging industries. I'm going to use the words emerging industries, new industries, sort of interchangeably, but I guess that needs to be understood in the context of a new industry or emerging industry in a particular market. And there's really three broad things that an emerging industry might be doing or might be seeking to do. First, it might be seeking to be a direct substitute for the same product but produced elsewhere. So, for example, imported. So examples of that are the sesame industry, where it's a very strong import industry at the moment, but domestic production may be seeking to substitute for some of those imports. That may be true for aspects of the truffles industry, where we're seeking to provide a substitute in export markets for the Australian product. It's true of aspects of pomegranates and seaweed. So a direct substitute for the same product which already exists. A second type of characteristic of emerging industry is it might be a new product, but satisfying existing needs at a lower cost or higher quality than would maybe otherwise the case. And again, aspects of Australia's various emerging industries satisfy that sort of characteristic. And the third one is that an emerging industry may be a new product that satisfies new needs that were not previously met in the particular way that the product can meet them. And examples of that are insects, aspects of seaweed, where seaweed, for example, is used to reduce emissions from animals when it's fed to animals, aspects of hemp, particularly when hemp is used in a construction basis, and also aspects of native bees, which I'll talk about, native stingless bees in particular, which we'll talk about in a moment. So there's three different ways in which an emerging industry may seek to enter into a market. Then in another dimension, there's also 3 ways that an emerging industry may enter into a market. It may enter as a whole product, that is, as a sale of a whole product which goes directly to the consumer. So a particular fruit, for example, or a particular native food goes directly to the consumer as a whole product. Alternatively, the emerging industry may be seeking to be an ingredient in a subsequent processed chain, which could be, I've put food here, but it could also be other forms of processing. For an example of that would be extracting protein from insects and then using that protein in subsequent processing to form an ingredient in a processed product. Similarly with sesame, you can also get protein out of sesame and a range of other products. And a third possibility is the industry may also be providing a service or an experience which goes beyond the product itself. So I think a good example here is native bees, native stingless bees. A large proportion of sales in that industry in the moment is selling hives to households, to consumers. They're obviously selling a product, that's the hive, but at the same time, there's a whole experience that goes with that product. And associated with that is a lot of information, a lot of interesting things that people get to examine and understand. And of course, if they're in the right area, producing honey for themselves. And then similarly,
excuse me, David, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. Could you please put your screen on full screen mode rather than presenter mode so that we're not seeing the next slide and that it's bigger and clearer for everybody?
Not sharing.
No, you've totally thrown me, Brendan.
I'm sorry, David, but there's been a request to switch to a different mode so that it's clearer. Ellie, if you wouldn't mind coming in if needs be to help explain that to David.
Yeah, David, when you've got the presentation open on your screen.
Okay. Can you see, is it?
No, it's not on our screen. You can just see your desktop view.
Okay, I think it needs to go here. Is that there now?
Yeah, perfect. And if you go up to the top and click on slideshow.
Yep.
Yeah. And go from current slide. Yeah. Still in that same mode.
Still wants to show you the next slide. Hang on.
Perfect. There you go.
Okay, that's rather tricky, isn't it? All right, sorry guys, I've learned something today. So the final point I want to make about native stingless bees is also there's a service that goes with the product, and that is, of course, potential pollination services. So there's really 3 different things that an emerging industry can do. Now, I think the distinction between the whole product and the ingredient in particular is quite important because, as we'll go through the discussion, there's a bit of a tension in consumer trends out there between the demand for whole products and the demand for processed products which have particular or perceived to have particular environmental characteristics. So if you've ever dealt with management consultants, you'll know that it's compulsory to have a 3x3 matrix at some point. So here's our 3x3 for today. Obviously, you can locate any emerging industry in this matrix of whether it's a direct substitute, a new product, or a new product and new needs, and whether it's a whole product, an ingredient or a service or experience. Okay, so now I want to just jump to some learnings from, there's a very, very large literature on how it is that new products succeed or fail. And essentially it gets down to very much a consumer focus and understanding what it is the industry can provide to the consumer competitively with alternative products. Now, this is a very dense slide. Apologise, but I couldn't think of any better way of getting it down. Essentially, if you look through the literature, there's 4 big sets of questions that any new product or new industry needs to be able to answer. And the first one is, what value does the industry provide to consumers? So what is it that you're giving to the consumer that the consumer can't get elsewhere? How is it you're generating value to consumers? And part of that means, what price do you need to be charging to ensure that the consumer is getting value for the product? The second thing to keep in mind is the question of who or what are the competitors to your product in providing value to consumers. Now, who the competitors are, what the competitors are, really depends very much on the industry. But a key point is the competitors may come from unexpected places. They may be existing agricultural industries, they may be other emerging industries, which are competitors, or they may be alternative processes altogether, which provide competition. And I'll give some examples of that in a moment. Then thirdly, the industry needs to be able to work out how it can maintain a competitive and maintain or establish and maintain a competitive advantage over time. Any new industry as it's emerging, competitors to that industry won't just sort of stand by and lose market share if that's what they're doing. Obviously, competitors will react and respond in various ways. And so the industry needs to be able to work out how to maintain that competitive advantage. And finally, the industry needs to understand or work out how to maintain its own internal capacity to continue to adapt to changes in the world. And this is particularly important in the agri-futures context, of course, because it gets to questions about what sorts of research facilities or what sorts of research is required in order to continue to improve the product. And it also gets to individual industry questions in terms of where can they find the right quantity and quality of labour, for example. What training can be provided to labour? If it's an industry that involves lots of growers, how can they be trained? Is there a development path for growers? And so on. So these key questions, these apply actually to every product you can think of that is new in the market, but obviously applies particularly well to emerging industries in the context of R&D. And if you think about those 3 different types of product impacts that I mentioned before, direct substitute or a new product satisfying existing needs or a new product satisfying new needs, each one of those has a slightly different set of requirements for success. For example, if the industry is seeking to be a direct substitute for an existing product, then price competition will be really, really important, because that's the only thing that will induce consumers to switch. If there's an existing source of the product, they need essentially a cheaper product. Or if it's the second column there, a new product that's satisfying existing needs but with better quality, then obviously the quality and reliability of the product is crucial. And then thirdly, if it's a new product satisfying a new range of needs, then there may well be some new infrastructure or some complementary goods and services that are required, or even changes in regulatory frameworks that may be required to ensure that that product is able to succeed in the market. And we'll give some examples of that a little bit later on. Okay, so I want to just talk briefly about something of a paradox in emerging industries, I think, is when you look across the broad sweep of all of this, is that agriculture is dominated by a number of or a few key industries. And yet in every country, there's a really, really strong search for new products. I came across this quote the other day from a chap called Alphonse de Candolle, who was a Swissman writing in the 1880s. He wrote this classic book about the origin of cultivated plants. But he made the point that even back then, in the 1880s, there'd hardly been any change in the key products that had been produced around the world. And in the couple of hundred years before the discovery of America and a couple of hundred years afterwards, it's still the same sort of products that, from his point of view in 1880, were being mostly produced in the world. And it's exactly the same situation today. Now, this is I think the only data graph I'm going to inflict on you, but I think it's worth thinking through. What this is showing is the cumulative share of either calories, the blue line, or protein, the red line, that's accounted for by a range of products which are along the horizontal axis. So the way you read this is if you look at wheat and read up from wheat, you see that wheat accounts for about 20% of calories and a bit under 20% of protein in the world. Then when you add in rice, we go up to just under 40% of calories. By the time you add in maize, we're getting close to 50%. And basically, it's the case that the top 5 products in the world, which is wheat, rice, maize, soybean, and sugarcane, account for 60% of all calories produced and consumed, and all protein produced and consumed in the world. And then it's only about 13 or so products that get you up to 80% of all calories and a little bit less than that of all protein. And it's similar, you get a similar story if you look across regions, or although I think this is quite telling when you look across the different regions. Africa has by far the most diverse production. It takes 15 commodities. Here on the bottom, I've just listed numbers 1 to 15 because the actual commodities in their ordering differs a little bit by region, but the point's the same. They have the most diverse, 15 commodities to get to 80%. In Asia, it's about 11 commodities to get to 80%. In Europe, it's about 8 commodities. In Oceania, which is the region that includes Australia and New Zealand, it's only 5 commodities that accounts for 80% of calories and protein. And then by the time you get to North America, it's even less. It's really only 3, actually 4 commodities. So global production of agriculture is really, really highly concentrated in a few commodities. And I could show you these exact same charts over time. And if you look at it over time, what you see is it basically hasn't changed for the period of time that we've had really, really detailed data available from the FAO. In response to that, though, in just about every region in the world, there's really, really strong support for a range of emerging industries. So what I want to first of all is just illustrate this with Asia to start with. I could do exactly the same sort of presentation for the US or for Europe or for Africa for that matter, but I think it's interesting to look at Asia given that it's in our region. There is a whole series of research papers like this one that we've printed or copied the title of here, Rediscovering Asia's Forgotten Crops. It's all part of a very big program in the FAO called Future Smart Food, where the FAO is strongly supporting research and extension and so on to develop a range of emerging industries in Asia. And then that little table there shows you some of the what's a subset really of the emerging industries that they're looking at. And you can see that some of those overlap with the ones for Australia, and some are ones that we would think would be reasonably well established in Australia, but are a bit more emerging in the Asian market. So this is it's hard to overstate, I think, the amount of effort that's going into this analysis or development of emerging industries in Asia. Another really interesting example is a group. It's an NGO called NTFP, so that's Non-Timber Forest Products EP Exchange Program. So they are looking at forests in Asia and trying to understand what foods you can get out of the forest. And they've published this fantastic book, Wild Tastes in Asia, which really goes through forests in about half a dozen Asian countries, so Malaysia, Indonesia, countries in Southeast Asia in our region, looking at what products can be developed. And that's, of course, directly analogous to Australia's emerging industry of native foods. So we have an emerging industry that looks at a range of traditional products in Australia. Most of them are not forest products. They're probably more like desert products. But these emerging industries in Asia, Wild Taste of Asia, are a direct analogue. And I thought it was interesting just to print out there the sort of the number of supporters of this particular group, NTFP. You can see that it's the EU, it's the Worldwide Fund, it's UNDP, MacArthur Foundation. So a lot of substantive sort of organisations really supporting this. And then another example in our own region, I don't know to what extent people are familiar with the Pacific, very high incidence of diabetes and various other issues. For a number of years now, there's been this program called Pacific Island Food Revolution. It was actually a telly show and a program and a competition, all these things mixed together, trying to encourage people in Pacific Island economies to consume just traditional foods, right? Their own foods that they grow themselves, instead of highly processed imported foods. And what that program thinks, or what they concluded from an evaluation, is that if even only 10% of the people that were involved maintain their new habits, that would lead to net health savings of $46 million, which is a fairly substantive amount of money in the Pacific context, particularly if you think about Australia's aid program in the Pacific. So a lot of effort in our region and a lot of trends developing emerging products. I'm talking a lot about agriculture here, but of course agriculture is not the only use of some of our emerging products. In particular, hemp and the fibres from hemp can be used to make a cement product, hempcrete, which is an alternative building product. It's interesting that also in Asia, they are looking for these exact same alternative building products. I just thought this was a fascinating example where they have used shredded nappies, that is shredded disposable nappies, obviously they clean them first, as a replacement for some of the ingredients in concrete, in particular, replacing up to 40% of the sand used in concrete. So they're really killing two birds with one stone here by cleaning up the environment and providing a new building product. But there's obviously no reason why Australia also couldn't be exporting a hemp-based product to satisfy these exact same needs. And my understanding is that these hemp structural properties are very similar to the structural properties of the sorts of things that they're exploring within this particular piece of research. All right, so that's a little bit about some things that are going on in our region, really making the point that the idea of emerging industries is a global idea, even though we focus in Australia on our particular set for good reasons. There is some fundamental moves in the world to support and develop emerging industries. The other stream of literature I wanted to talk about here is this idea of mega trends. So there's kind of a cottage industry of people producing reports on mega trends. Australia's own CSIRO, I think, is a key player, probably one of the leaders in this. But as we looked around, there's more than a dozen substantive documents looking at mega trends in the world and how they're likely to affect future production. CSIRO's material, if you haven't looked at it, is well worth a read. They identify 7 particular mega trends that they think are important, which is adapting to climate change, clearly important for agriculture, leaner, cleaner, greener. So this is all trends moving towards net zero emissions and protecting biodiversity. The escalating health imperative, which is similar to the sorts of things I was just talking about in Asia, looking to deal with these health issues, particularly through the use of new products. Geopolitical shifts, hard to know exactly how this applies directly to agriculture, but everyone would be aware Big things are happening in the world, recent developments, China, Russia, etc. These are all some of the geopolitical shifts that that CSIRO looks at. Digital technologies, autonomous technologies, also very important. And from CSIRO's point of view, unlocking the human dimension, trends in diversity, equity, and transparency. I'm not sure whether that's a genuine trend or something that CSIRO would like to see as a trend, but it's certainly important in many aspects of what happens around the world. If we look across at all of the dozens of studies that I mentioned that are thinking about megatrends, then what we see is essentially all of those can be divided into these sorts of categories here. So reading from the right to the left, it's rapid technological change, demography, environmental pressures, and shifting power. Rapid technological development is clearly very important for agriculture. The next slide will talk about what that means. Demography is, I think, a trend that also ends up being very important for agriculture and emerging industries. Here, there's a general focus on demographic shifts, which is essentially ageing of populations in most parts of the world, but in particular, ageing of populations in developed countries, so countries like Australia, relative to younger populations in some developing countries. And that's why migration appears as a really important part of these demographic trends, because migration is increasingly seen as a major way of developed countries getting sufficient labour to do all the sorts of things that we'd like to do. Environmental pressures also really, really important in the agricultural context. So maybe I'll just jump directly forward to the specific agricultural trends here as a subset of those broader trends. And what we see when you looking specifically at agriculture, there's really 5 key trends that are driving or expected to drive lots of production. One is adapting to climate change. So this is the fact that we may well have changing production zones. We will have changing biosecurity impacts as temperature changes and pests and diseases can move to areas that they previously couldn't. And then weather and climate variability or increases in variability. Agriculture already deals, of course, with a lot of variability, but it's expected to increase over time. But as well as adapting, there's also the question of managing environmental impacts. As we know, agriculture has been identified in a number of places as being a potential cause of environmental impacts and also a potential cause of greenhouse gas emissions, particularly when you look at large-scale animal-based agriculture, meat in particular, livestock. So there's some trends to do with improving the efficiency of production techniques within agriculture, trends to do with competing for natural resources, and then trends to do with minimising greenhouse gas emissions. And a number of our emerging industries that we listed before do have some quite unique positive greenhouse characteristics, which I think are important. Rapid technical change, also crucial for agriculture, precision agriculture, robotics, sensor technologies, all of those things we see happening very, very rapidly in agriculture. Interesting question arises here. Does that trend particularly favour emerging industries, or is it more likely to particularly favour existing industries? And I think we probably see at the moment that it's the large, broad-scale industries that are able to make most advantage of some of these developments. The health trend, and it sort of intersects with changing consumer demands as well, I think are particularly important trends because they're some of the biggest commentary you see around agriculture and emerging industries in general, is the need for improved nutrition, the need to manage diseases, and the need for specialist products for individual consumers as part of this general idea of individual health. So some of the trends towards gluten-free products, for example, are a subset of that, trying to understand particular needs of particular consumers. And then changing consumer demands, transparency in supply chains. I'm sure you've all observed developments in animal activists in recent recent weeks even. It seems to me to be part of this push towards transparency and what's going on in supply chains. There's also subsets of consumers that have particular ethical and environmental demands and needs that they're placing on that. So they want to consume for ethical reasons or environmental reasons. This is, of course, relates to, they want organic products or they want fair trade products, et cetera, and related to that, of course, is health demands. So a lot of trends affecting agriculture, and a lot of these are health related. What does this mean for emerging industries? I want to give sort of two conflicting examples of what it might mean, because I think the trends are not necessarily moving in the same direction. One is a big project that the Lancet being the medical journal in the UK, did with another group whose name escapes me for the moment. I think they're called EAT. They've developed what they call a planetary health diet. Now, they have a really good picture. I'd recommend you go to their website to have a look at their picture. I can't produce it here, obviously, for copyright reasons, but they're looking to transform the diets that people eat by increasing consumption of fruit, vegetables, nuts and legumes and reducing consumption of red meat and sugar. And what they have in mind here, when you look at their particular diagrams, is the fresh whole product. Right? So they mean increasing global consumption of fresh fruits and vegetables, nuts and legumes. They have a small window of possibility in their diet for highly processed, say, plant-based meats, for example, but really not very big. Their vision is mostly a diet rich in relatively fresh plant-based foods. So I think that's an important thing to observe, and obviously that's something that is very positive for some of the emerging industries in Australia. In contrast to that, let me give you an example of a group called the X Prize. You probably have heard of X Prize. They're the ones that fund big things like, getting a rocket into orbit, which I think Jeff Bezos won. X Prize is started by a guy called Peter Diamandis, who's an American. I presume he's a billionaire. Anyway, they have this series of prizes, and they also did their own little megatrends exercise, looking at what are the trends affecting food production. And what they came up with, their idea of the most important thing to do first, is to develop essentially a meat replacement for chicken and fish. Right, so meat replacement meaning chicken and fish made out of plants or some other ingredients, not made out of chickens or actual fish, that can basically look and be indistinguishable from actual chickens and fish. And so they are offering a prize, $15 million US, which is about 23 million Australian dollars, which for perspective is about half of AgriFuture's R&D spend in 2021-22. So it's a big chunk of money. They're going to give that prize to a winner of this competition. And the finalists of this competition, you see there's about 6 of them there. 2 of them, this Celex and this Eternal, are fermentation products. So that's where you go, you have a big vat and it's also called a bioreactor. You're just directly growing the meat essentially from a stem cell, but you're growing it artificially in a vat, so it's grown in chemicals and doesn't have any broader environmental impact. So that's the first 2 finalists, and the other 4 finalists are plant-based food guys. Now, I wanted to work out, okay, so which plants are going to be used in each of these 4 categories. If you go to their individual websites, it's actually very, very hard to work out because a lot of these processes are proprietary, so they're not quite telling you. But as far as I can tell, there's 3 components. One is some form of legume. So some form of, it might be chickpeas, it might be sesame, some form of legume that's high in protein. A second ingredient looks like some form of algae. So that may be seaweed, for example, or could be some other algae. And the third ingredient would be some sort of very common oilseed product like canola. So if you think about what does this particular view of the world mean for emerging industries, or what does it mean for agriculture, it most likely means an increase in demand for relatively broad acre protein sources, so legumes, also an increase in demand for what is broad acre oil seeds, and then something in the middle. But what this product will be is almost the exact opposite to the vision from the Lancet, right? It is a product which is highly processed, where the ingredients have been completely pulled apart from the original product and put together in a different way to create a product that looks like what people would otherwise consume, meat or chicken. But as I say, a lot of money going into this. Talk just for a couple of seconds about this Beyond Meat story, because I think this is a story which should cause pause for any forecasters out there, which includes us trying to forecast things. Beyond Meat was one of the American industries that appeared in just before the pandemic as a plant-based meat producer, not as sophisticated as the ones that may win the X Prize, essentially producing like a mince-like product rather than something that looks like a fish fillet. But there was really, really high expectations. So that when their share price started at 25 and when they floated, it shot up to about $250, so 10-fold increase. Really, really high expectations. But then what happened since 2019 is that actually no one bought any of these products. Well, they did, sorry, some people bought them, but there was no growth. So the American market for plant-based meats has stagnated. There's sales, but the sales are not growing. There's a lot of competitors in this particular segment of the market, at least 60 in the US. And at the moment in the US, the plant-based meats are more expensive than actual meat, particularly in the American market, of course, where there's a lot of ground beef. And so what's happened recently, so a lot of analysts did some kind of amazing forecasts of how much Beyond Meat would be able to sell. They used this concept of the addressable market. So if you could just switch, X% of consumers out of meat into plant-based meat, and you did that over time, you'd have enormous sales. But it turned out that none of that came true. And Beyond Meat now, its share price is currently sitting at about $11 US, and probably, there's talk of going under altogether. They're not the only ones. There's a couple of other companies, similar story. The Financial Times really has a really detailed explanation of what's going on. But I guess it's important because we need to be careful when we're thinking about what is the consumer actually going to consume. I think there was a lot of presumptions that consumers would switch into plant-based meats in the same way that they had already switched from dairy into soy or almond milk, et cetera, rice milk. But it turns out the switch to meat is considerably more complicated than that. Okay, what does this all mean? So how do we bring this together in a sense for Australia's emerging industries, in particular the ones that AgriFutures are supporting? The first point to make is that all of these industries are extraordinarily diverse. So it's very, very hard to generalise without going into the details of any particular industry. And almost any generalisation you make probably won't be precisely true for some particular industry. So just bear with me. We're deliberately trying to generalise in a world where that's hard to do. But there's some common themes, I think, when you look at the case study industries that we were looking at. And let me just reiterate, forecasting is really hard here because generally we don't have the data that we might like to have. But I think it's fair to say there is a very wide range of opportunities for all of Australia's emerging industries. Right? So the concept of the addressable market, and keep in mind what I said about the mistakes that people made when it came to Beyond Meat, but the addressable market is very large relative to the current size of the industry. So that's a generalisation, but in general, these industries are quite small at the moment, but there's potential in either particular products, for example, using protein from insects for plant food, for pet food. Protein from insects for pet food is a very large industry relative to the size of the current insect industry. Secondly, demand growth for particular product types is actually quite strong, particularly, and this is when we're looking, say, at some of the products that we might want to have import substitution for. Sesame is an example. If you're looking at import growth has been very strong in some of these products. So that gives you a sense that potential consumer growth for the domestic substitute could also be strong. And then if you look at in various regions outside the world, a lot of these products are growing very strongly. So we found that overall each of the 8 case studies has the potential to at least double current production over the next 10 years, but in some cases considerably more than that. However, competition and capital constraints may well be an issue for some of these industries. And also there's some of the industries where the natural rate of expansion may limit the extent of growth. For example, in native stingless bees, there's a limit to how rapidly hives can be propagated from the original source. So there's some natural constraints there. So there's a very wide range of opportunities. When we talk with people about constraints, a really, really common constraint that comes up is some form of labour constraint. Now, sometimes it's attracting labour. Sometimes it's to do with the activities being relatively labour intensive. Sometimes it's to do with obtaining sufficiently skilled labour. But this is a very common theme in emerging industries. And of course, it's a very common theme across Australian agriculture, particularly in horticulture. Obviously, any emerging industry needs to have a strategy to deal with labour, but it's not something that the industry can actually deal with by itself. It's a much the availability of labour in the Australian economy at the moment is a much bigger industry. And 2 things I think that were very, very interesting developments really in the last little while is the extension of the PALM scheme. So that's the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. So this is where traditionally it's been in agriculture from some source markets where migrants have been able to come for limited periods of time to service those industries. It's been extended, and it was extended again in the last budget, where there are now more possibilities of getting labour from a greater variety of Pacific countries than previously was the case, and more spots, if you like, potentially available. So that's something that's worth considering as thinking through where the labour might come from. And also note that recently there was a major, I think it was released maybe about 4 weeks ago, a major review of Australia's migration program. It hasn't hit home into actual policy yet, but the review made a very strong point that Australia's migration scheme often is not working as well as it could in terms of delivering skills that Australian industry and Australian producers need. So it's something worth keeping an eye on as a labour constraint. Other key constraints that you see in some emerging industries is cost competitiveness is not there yet. So that obviously requires some further development because, as I said, if you're offering a new product to a consumer and you want the consumer to take it up, it really does need to be cost competitive. I mentioned the point about naturally slow reproduction rates in some industries, which will be a constraint. In some other industries, getting information to consumers has been a constraint. And it's certainly something that, for example, people in the hemp industry talk to us about, just some sort of humorous challenges in getting that information out, because, of course, hemp is largely a misunderstood product in some regards because of its origins in the modern era. So getting that information out it can sometimes be difficult. And the other one is that many of the beneficial greenhouse and environmental properties of some of the emerging industries, so I'm thinking seaweed, hemp again, are not fully reflected in current regulations or not fully captured, for example, in Australia's climate change policies. So that is a institutional development that may be required to help, if you like, or work on to help these emerging industries to continue to grow up to their full potential. All right, so what I'd like to do now, with Brenda's permission, who I think will moderate this, is really see if we can move this to an open discussion. I'd be really interested to see hear from your own perspectives how you see big trends in the world, how you see the key constraints in your particular industries, and how you see, some of these wider trends, competition around the world, developments around the world are impinging on the industry in Australia. As Brenda said, put your questions in the chat feature, and I think we can go from there. Just as a reminder, here was the list of questions that you need to be able to answer. So I'd be really interested to hear what your perspectives are on that. Just before we close down the slideshow, so that this gets on the recording, if you do have any follow-up questions that we're unable to talk about in the half hour or so that we've got for discussion, please don't hesitate to email either myself or Yang at those addresses there. And of course, the AgriFutures people in charge are listed on this slide here. So I might, Brenda, hand over to you for discussion now.
Thanks very much, David. So we'll look at what's in the chat and just go through them in order. I do ask people to be succinct in their questions. At the moment, we've got a bit of time, but as questions come in, we will run out of time, obviously. We'll start with Nick. I'm sorry, I can't say your name, Nick, from DECA, who asks, David, have you looked at emerging industries from a government or state mindset, or have you looked at the role of government? Is that a clear question?
Yeah. So definitely, I mean, certainly, so the state aspect of this, we haven't thought about this as in one state versus another, but the state access aspect comes out because different emerging industries have different climatic requirements, for example, and so they are more naturally associated in some states versus others. For example, native stingless bees only come so far south. A lot of native foods are very much a northern product. In terms of government involvement, I think this is a very important set of issues. So quite aside from government involvement in funding R&D, right, which is the matching contributions that government makes to AgriFutures and other R&D corporations, as I hinted before, there's a lot of regulatory issues that emerge in some of these industries. So, for example, hemp in construction, there's issues surrounding the construction code. Some of the products, seaweed products, for example, for reducing emissions, require, at least implicitly, a well-established regulatory framework in Australia for emissions reduction. And as you're all aware, that's just emerging. You wouldn't say that it's quite there yet. So I think government has a key role to play, key facilitating role, or maybe in some cases getting out of the way role in many of these emerging industries.
All right, thanks for that, David. We'll move on to Bella Annis, who asks, the new adaptability, the new competitive advantage, could emerging industries adapt to different policies and procedures in terms of stakeholder range of need and nation policy? Is that clear to you, David?
I think so. Well, yes, I mean, emerging industries have an advantage in some ways over existing industries because they're emerging. They can look at the landscape well in advance of ramping up major production, for example, and really think about where is this adaptation going to need to be. And I think, as I sort of hinted, to my mind, one of the biggest dichotomies out there is the question of a whole food product or an ingredient in a highly processed product. To me, there's a kind of, I'm sure there's plenty of demand for both, but at the same time, to me, there's a little bit of a tension between those two, because I'm sure you've all seen the rapidly emerging literature on the disadvantages of highly processed food products. Now, it's not clear to me how that applies to these really, really highly processed ones like XPRIZE is looking to develop. I'm not sufficient of a nutritionist, but I look at the literature and I see this kind of divergence there. So I think that's something that industries really need to that emerging industries have the opportunity to think about well in advance.
Thanks, David. The next one is a plug for the hemp industry. Hemp building will be discussed at the upcoming Fibre Forum run by the Australian Hemp Council on the 14th to the 15th of June. And no doubt you can get more information about that on the website. Moving on.
We want hemp, not shredded nappies, right?
Yeah, that's it. All right, moving on to Kendall Baku. Thanks for a brilliant presentation. Can we please get access to a copy of the recording? Yes, you will if you have registered, Kendall. If you haven't registered, then you'll need to find somebody who has, or you could potentially email myself or Olivia. Next is Stephen Drummett. At the Agri-Food Innovation Forum on the 18th of July, Toowoomba was sharing a light on algae production. Question is, has algae production in Australia been represented in your research? And we know that seaweed has been part of it. So
yes, seaweed is definitely part of it. I'm not sure that we've necessarily gone into all of the finer details of the algae aspects of seaweed, but definitely. But I'd be really interested, Stephen, in your view on algae as an ingredient is to some of these really highly processed food products. Is that something the industry is looking at?
Stephen, are you there? Stephen, would you like to come off mute and make a comment? Just noting that algae, macroalgae is seaweed, microalgae, of course, are usually like a plankton. So, Stephen, did you want to make a comment?
Sure, Brenda. Thanks, David. Yeah, the algae production, I was more talking around microalgae for this. So, yeah, we've been talking to the University of Queensland, talking around some of the uses for algae, and that includes for medication, for pharmacy, and even for construction. But it's a great source also of protein. So yeah, it's just a lot of the micro businesses have done a little bit of, sorry, a lot of the microalgae businesses have done a lot of work in the pharmaceutical space, and they're we're basically bringing together at the Agri-Food Innovation Forum 3 producers and University of Queensland and someone that has invested in this space as well, to explain why they're investing in it, why it's so important. So that'll be at our gala dinner in the evening after the forum. So yeah, I'd encourage you to come along to that.
Thanks for that, Stephen. Yeah, microalgae is something that AgriFutures is just is having under discussion. So we'll see where that goes. But yeah, it's
fantastic. Would love to be a part of all
very
those discussions,
interesting.
Brenda.
Yeah, thank you for that. We'll move on then back to hemp. Hemp seeds nutritionally equivalent to deep sea fish. Do you think Beyond Meat could have done better by not trying to replicate the look of fish and meat?
Yeah, that's a really, really interesting question. It's always puzzled me, and particularly the X Prize, right? So the characteristic of the X Prize is they want to make a whole cut, right, that looks like a chicken breast, but is made out of, you know, this or deconstructed, you know, highly processed product. Now, for some reason, X Prize, when they did their macro scan, megatrends, that's what they concluded was needed. But as I pointed out, there's this tension, I reckon, between whole foods and highly processed foods. And hemp seeds and various, you know, minimally processed hemp products, we already see, of course, in our supermarkets, shelves and so on. And I would have thought that's an alternative pathway to be promoting the whole foods benefits. But I don't know how this is going to come out. Literally, to me, this is a trend or two different trends where it's very, very difficult to predict.
Thanks for that. Move on to Mick Crouch, who says, on the labour challenges for industry, the meat processing industry continues to leverage palm, who you referred to, and a meat industry labour agreement in a growing capacity. That's just a comment. Did you want to expand briefly on that, Mick, if you're there? Might not be there. Yeah, did you have any response to that, David?
Palm is not a panacea by any chance, and in other work we're doing, we're kind of pointing out some pretty extreme limitations even on the expanded palm program, but it's at least something that's there at the moment.
Thank you. Let's move on to Nick Harris from DECA. David, how big a constraint or benefit is Australia's regulations to emerging industries? And well, I'll let you answer that. And how do we compare to other countries?
Very, very hard to answer in general. Some industries would have very few constraints regulation-wise, but they might have constraints in other ways. I think the biggest one to me is taking full advantage of some of the greenhouse properties and even some of the environmental properties of some of the products. For example, using insects to manage waste, that sort of thing. Using seaweed, the lower profile of emissions per, you know, whatever ton of concrete or however you want to measure it for hemp. A lot of the full advantages of that can't be taken up yet until there is effectively a carbon price in the system that is working, and that's really still emerging. So I think that's a constraint on the environmental side. On the food, the other major regulator of new foods is obviously FSANZ, the Food Health, whatever, Australian. Anyway, Food Standards Australia, New Zealand. Sorry,
Australia, New Zealand. Yeah.
And as far as at least I think as far as we've discovered, that most products get the tick with FSANZ, but that could be an issue for, you know, some products as they emerge. So very hard to answer that question in general. I think it really depends on the particular industry.
And in terms of comparing globally, I mean, Australia does appear to be highly regulated. Is that something that you see being an issue in emerging industries?
I think globally regulations vary a lot. Again, I think you might find that, for example, where hemp construction is very traditional in some European countries, has a much longer history, the regulatory factors there might be a bit easier. Similarly, in some Asian countries where insects have a very, very long history in human consumption, different sets of issues emerge. But broadly in Europe's a pretty, you know, regulated set of economies. I'd say that probably similar regulations there. but maybe a little bit less in Asia. Australia, where we tend to have much more stringent regulations than most other countries, is our biosecurity for obvious reasons. Yeah. So there may be times when biosecurity becomes more of a constraint in Australia.
Yeah, thank you. Move on to Pratik Bunny. Scaling up market demand and production supply put these emerging industries in a chicken and egg situation. Which one should happen first? Any thoughts on this?
Demand and or supply. It's well, now you're talking to an economist, right? So an economist will always say the demand curve and the supply curve must intersect, and you can't move one beyond another. I would say you've really got to work on two fronts. So one, it's really important to understand the exact nature of the product that you're offering the consumer and what is the proposition for the consumer, because nothing can really happen until that's really understood. So if you're wanting to get capital, for example, you won't get someone to fund you with capital unless you can put this consumer proposition. And I think it needs to be a really well understood consumer proposition that's not too divorced from what consumers are actually likely to do, as opposed to what you imagine they should do or might do, as in the case with Beyond Meat. So I think that's to me that comes first, is do you really have that product, and what are you offering? That's all the literature says that, and then the scaling up will go from there. Because if you have a genuine product that the consumers want, scaling from there is, I won't say automatic's the wrong word, but it can flow much easier from there.
Thanks, David. Now, we've still got a few questions to go. I'm thinking that we're getting too late to add any new ones at this point. So if you've got anything pressing, say it now. Now we're going to close questions off.
I've got everything turned on.
And maybe whoever's talking, if you could just go on mute, please.
Oh, so I think it's been recorded.
They can't see me.
No.
Leanne, thank you, Leanne. So going back up now to Manjari. David, this is with respect to your slide on forgotten crop plants from Asia. How is Australia planning to adapt some of the forgotten plants from Asia?
Well, it's interesting. So some of the forgotten plants are kind of relatively more well established here. I'm not sure. So I guess the point I was trying to make there was that there's big overlap between or intersection in the sets of new industries that Asia is exploring and the sets of new industries that Australia is exploring, right? So there's an overlap there. To the extent that someone can find a market in Australia for non-traditional products which may have come out of Asia, then there's nothing stopping that from happening aside from biosecurity if you want to import something. I would suggest that something like durian would never become an Australian product, but there's others. What's that one? There's one that's a Chinese product.
Juju.
Juju, and Canadian. Where Hascaps are from? They may be Asian originally. I'm not totally sure. I may be wrong on that. But I think what the point is that there is a kind of a really big universe of emerging products which have the potential to satisfy new needs. And the Australian industry is kind of free to pick up any of those or focus on the ones that are already being focused on.
Thank you. Moving on to Madeline Maury, what is being done to attract and skill a local workforce in these emerging industries rather than relying on international migrants?
I don't know. You'd have to ask the individual industries what they're specifically doing. All I know is that every time we do any form of agricultural project, getting more people into the regions is really difficult. So what individual industries are doing, I'm not sure, although, this gets at making sure that you're offering value and the right price to consumers and also making a profit, because really the only way of attracting labour out of one place to another is to offer them a higher wage, right, than they could otherwise get. So profitability becomes a really key consideration here.
I will say that AgriFutures, it's a strategic priority for AgriFutures is workforce management. We have a new team that's looking into this. I'm not in that team, so I can't state any of the details, but it is a watch this space, and you may find information about this on the website. Moving on to PSHEN. In what ways does this research project findings methodology differ to and is similar to or overlaps with the 2019 project conducted by QUT under AgriFutures on horizon scanning opportunities for new technologies and industries? I don't know whether you've cited that project, David, and are able to comment on that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of overlap. In fact, there's a lot of overlap in many different discussions of emerging industries. But that's certainly one of the existing references we've drawn on in this analysis.
Okay. James is next. There are constraints on hemp for building being regulated the same as food, i.e. less than 1% THC. The Australian Industrial Hemp Alliance is working with our international partners to change this. James, that's a comment. Thank you for that. Moving on to Ellie. Ellie, in response to Ken, over the next few days, this is Ellie from AgriFutures saying, "Hi Kendall, over the next few days we will share the recording with everybody." Most of you will have known this, except for those coming late. Excuse me. Moving on to Bill Do. "Hi David and Yang. Through your presentation, I saw the research needs in the following two areas. What are your comments? 1, survey customers' needs in different demographic groups and special groups within Australia and other countries, e.g. the Pacific. 2, supply chain survey research to detail and investigate the costs along with supply chain of typical products of Australia and other countries." Now, you might need to see that because I couldn't quite interpret. I think there's a little bit of a grammar leak there. David, did you have a comment on that, and Yang?
Yeah, so definitely understanding customers, exactly how you would construct a survey probably depends on the particular product, and the nature of the product. So in some industries, even now, demand sort of exceeds ability to supply, like native stingless bees, as I've mentioned before. But in other industries, if you're wanting to get consumers to do something in particular slightly different to what they've traditionally done, so that would be, consumption of edible insects in the Australian sense, I think really understanding those consumer preferences will be really important. But I think it will vary by industry. And I think the point about supply chains, I think it's really important if you're wanting to insert an ingredient in particular into a supply chain, you really need to understand what's the existing cost of alternative ingredients in that supply chain, and can you do it for that price or cheaper? So I think understanding that is really, really important. Otherwise, when you're dealing with ingredients, like just ingredients, if you're just extracting something down to a group of amino acids, then, price will be pretty much everything for a given amino acid. So you really need to understand that.
Thanks, David. Comment from James. "We have in progress scope 1 to 4 for hemp carbon sequestration. We're replacing concrete is one aim." Thanks, James. Did you want to comment on that at all, David?
Yeah, I think that's terrific. And as James would know, there's a huge amount of research also in the traditional cement industry to find alternative ways to use less clinker. Basically, clinker is the thing that emits. And so there's, in some ways, you'll be competing with those guys, right? Who gets there first? So there's some alternate product chains which use alternative materials, which is more down the, physical chemistry line or physical alternative processes, and then hemp being an organic line. And I think that's clearly a key market for hemp, but also in competition with traditional cement, who are also doing lots of research to reduce their emissions.
Thanks for that comment. From Stephen Pycroft. Hi, David. Thanks for a great overview of trends and influences on emerging industries. Is it possible to quantify the peripheral benefits of an emerging industry, such as production of insect protein for aquaculture from waste organics, and calculations for cost of protein per kilogram so that that can become more competitive with available proteins?
Yes, I think it is possible to calculate all of that. The peripheral benefits, I mean, the one that's easiest to calculate, of course, is any greenhouse benefits, like what's that worth? Because at least we will have, we should have soon a reasonable indication of a price in the Australian economy. So that will give us a way of if by peripheral you mean, you know, sort of what economists call external benefits, so benefits that are solving an environmental problem, they can also be calculated. There's also a lot of, in terms of other environmental problems, a lot of work going on, particularly in New South Wales, that we're aware of in valuing other environmental issues. So waste being one, so that can be calculated. And of course, we know the alternative cost, right? So we know the cost of putting something in landfill. And so that sets a bound on the price that for waste management that, for example, the insect industry needs to be able to supply.
Good. Chris Stanley, who may have left, just wanted to thank you for your presentation. Adam Briggs asks the question, David, to answer your question, retention between whole food from Lancet and processed product from X Price, have any consumer insights been conducted in this space, e.g. sentiment, attitudes, willingness to pay? There's been a lot of discussion on the demand side, but there seems to be limited consumer insight material to draw on.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's bits and pieces of it, but this whole question, I couldn't find anything that directly, you know, in your sort of use the word willingness to pay, right? So that's a nice economist term that would allow us to compare willingness to pay based on different characteristics of product. I think that that's something, a piece of research that could very usefully be done. And I suspect you would find quite a bigger market segmentation. But I think, you know, that's a little bit what happened to Beyond Meat, right? They didn't quite have their consumers lined up, or they didn't have their consumers lined up at the right price point. So I would agree with was it Adam, that's
Adam.
An area where there's, I think, not enough yet that we to understand.
Terrific. Well, we just got a couple more thank yous, and that's it in terms of questions and comments. Did anyone want to put their hand up for a last couple of minutes of questions before we complete the session? Not seeing anybody. So it's been a very rich discussion. It's been very big picture, but it's really provided that sort of structural framework, in a sense, to be thinking about what the different influences are that may benefit and also be of constraint to emerging industries, Australia, in the context of what's going on in the greater world. So I very much appreciate your perspective and the presentation. There's a couple of last minutes that have come on. So Andrew is having a comment. Having played into the food waste to vegan markets, what people say and do differs markedly. There's a bit of a chuckle there, so it sounds like there's an agreement that behaviours and intentions are not necessarily the same. Malcolm,
yeah,
thanks. Yeah. Malcolm, and that comes across in surveys too. How do you construct a survey so that you're getting what's actually going on, what people's behaviours really are, not how they would like to present themselves, or even how they might like to behave. So it's a very interesting space in terms of social research. And Malcolm just says, hi, Brenda, can I be connected to people at AgriFutures? We're not doing anything just at the moment. I suggest that you look at the emails, and I do note that I'm actually finishing with AgriFutures this week, so there is an email there for Olivia who you could contact. and you'll get that email in the recording, Malcolm. Anna says, thank you. More thanks. I think there's just thanks now. Thank you for all of those who have appreciated the presentation, who've got some benefit from it. Certainly thank both David and Yang for the effort they've put into it. A very complex project, actually, to provide that big picture and then drill down into 8 case studies with what's going on in the local sector with all the influences internationally. So appreciate it, everybody. I think we're at a place where we'll sign off now, all on time with a few early minutes. Were there any last comments that you'd like to make, David or Yang?
No, that's probably it. As you say, there's when you see the final report, there's a lot more detail, obviously, that we go into than that we can't go into in a webinar. So, but hopefully that gives you a sense, at least, of some of the broader picture stuff to think about. And also, you know, I guess a lot of people present megatrends as if there's some sort of inevitability in some way. But I think it's not true, right? None of these are inevitable, so that the responses and the underlying research of the industry are really, really crucial in determining outcomes, as well as trends that you may be able to identify.
Thank you. Well, terrific. So all the best, everybody, in your endeavours. I hope whatever you take from this can be used for your benefit as well as for others. Wishing you well. All the best. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks all.